for generations. 70. Many communities have been taught to look outward for protection, order, and solutions. We are told that safety must come from distant institutions, that stability can only be granted by systems that were designed without us in mind. But what if that belief itself is the trap? What if true survival begins the moment a community realizes its own power? Farrakhan's message forces an uncomfortable but necessary question. Who is truly responsible for the condition of our neighborhoods, our families, and our future? His words do not begin with blame, but with accountability. He challenges black communities to see themselves not as passive victims of circumstance, but as active guardians of their own destiny. Safety, discipline, and dignity, he argues, cannot be outsourced. They must be built, protected, and sustained from within. This is not a call rooted in anger, but in clarity. It is about recognizing that systems which repeatedly fail to protect, uplift, or respect a people cannot be depended upon indefinitely. Order does not begin with authority, it begins with unity. Survival does not start with permission, it starts with organization. When communities take ownership of their environment, their values, and their direction, they shift from being managed to being self-determined. This story is not about the past alone. It is about the present moment and the crossroads ahead. It asks whether communities will continue waiting for change, or whether they will become the source of it. Farrakhan's words are meant to provoke thought, spark dialogue, and awaken responsibility, not fear, not division. As you listen, keep an open mind. Reflect on what self-respect, self-discipline, and self-governance truly mean in today's world. If this perspective resonates with you, support the conversation by liking this video, subscribing to the channel, and sharing it with someone who needs to hear it. This is more than a message, it is the beginning of a deeper discussion. Once a community begins to understand its own power, another realization often follows, quieter, but more unsettling. If strength can come from within, then why has so much effort been spent convincing people that change can only arrive through systems that repeatedly disappoint them? This is where Farrakhan's critique of the political structure enters the story, not as a sudden shift, but as a continuation of the same awakening. For many black Americans, the act of voting was once filled with hope, even danger, because it symbolized entry into a promise long denied. Yet over generations, that promise has worn thin. Farrakhan frames this disillusionment not as ignorance or apathy, but as the perspective of those who have paid attention. He argues that the political system was constructed long before black people were considered full participants, built on foundations that prioritized power, wealth, and control for a narrow few. Expecting such a system to suddenly transform into a vehicle of liberation, he suggests, ignores both history and lived experience. This understanding does not emerge overnight. It develops through patterns that repeat themselves across decades. New leaders rise, speeches are delivered, campaigns promise reform, and yet the conditions in many black communities remain largely unchanged. Schools struggle, neighborhoods are neglected, and opportunities arrive slowly, if at all. Over time, participation begins to feel less like empowerment and more like ritual, a performance that offers the appearance of choice without addressing the underlying structure. Yet Farrakhan's message does not end in resignation. He does not suggest withdrawal as a solution, nor does he dismiss political engagement entirely. Instead, he reframes the relationship between oppressed communities and power. The problem, he argues, is not participation itself, but participation without leverage. When people approach a system divided, fragmented, and uncertain of their own strength, they enter negotiations already at a disadvantage. Unity, on the other hand, changes the equation. History offers quiet proof of this idea. Periods of progress did not arrive because the system developed a conscience, but because collective pressure made inaction costly. When communities organized their voices, their labor, and their resources around shared goals, the system responded not out of goodwill, but necessity. Gains were limited, often incomplete. But they were real. Farrakhan points to these moments as evidence that even a flawed structure can be forced to yield when confronted by discipline, united self-interest. This perspective reshapes disillusionment into strategy. Instead of asking whether the system deserves trust, The question becomes whether it can be compelled to respond. Unity transforms participation from hope-based belief into calculated action. Without it, voting feels symbolic and hollow. With it, engagement becomes one tool among many, not a savior, but a pressure point. The danger Farrakhan warns against is mistaking awareness for action. Recognizing corruption without building collective power leads only to cynicism. Cynicism, in turn, drains energy, leaving communities stuck between distrust and dependency. The system remains intact, not because it is just, but because it is unchallenged in any meaningful way. By linking political skepticism to community responsibility, Farrakhan closes the circle. Self-policing, economic cooperation. Cultural discipline and political engagement are not separate ideas, but interconnected pieces of the same vision. A community that governs itself locally is better positioned to negotiate externally. A people who know their value are harder to ignore. Voting without unity is a gesture. Unity with strategy becomes influence. In this way, the critique of politics is not an endpoint, but a warning. Change will not arrive simply because a box is checked or a name is chosen. It emerges when awareness matures into organization, and when participation is backed by collective strength. Without that, disillusionment persists. With it, even the most resistant systems are forced, however reluctantly, to listen. As awareness deepens and trust in distant systems begins to fade, the consequences of neglect become impossible to ignore. It is no longer just about policies debated in offices far removed from everyday life, but about what flows from the tap, what fills the air, and what surrounds children as they grow. Farrakhan's argument moves naturally into this terrain, linking political design to physical reality, where decisions made quietly manifest as harm experienced daily. He points to places like Flint and Newark not as isolated tragedies, but as symbols of a pattern that repeats itself with unsettling consistency. These were not sudden disasters caused by unforeseeable mistakes. They unfolded slowly, through ignored warnings, delayed responses, and choices that placed cost-saving above human well-being. What makes these cases resonate so deeply is not only the damage done, but where it was allowed to happen. Time and again, the communities most affected were those with the least political influence, the fewest resources, and the longest history of being overlooked. In Farrakhan's telling, this is where the idea of coincidence collapses, when the same outcomes appear across different cities, different states, and different administrations. The explanation shifts. Contaminated water systems, crumbling infrastructure, abandoned housing, and underfunded schools cluster in the same types of neighborhoods. These conditions do not drift randomly across the landscape. They settle where resistance is expected to be weakest and where voices are most easily dismissed. This reality ties directly back to the earlier question of power. A community that lacks leverage is more likely to be exposed to risk, because its suffering carries little consequence for those in control. When complaints can be delayed, minimized, or ignored without political cost, neglect becomes normalized. Farrakhan frames environmental harm not as an accident of bureaucracy, but as the physical expression of inequality. The body absorbs what the system refuses to address. The story becomes even clearer when viewed over time. Decades of disinvestment shape the present. Industrial sites are placed near residential areas. Waste facilities appear where land is cheapest, and maintenance is deferred until failure becomes inevitable. Meanwhile, the people living there are told to be patient, to trust investigations, to wait for studies and approvals. By the time action arrives, damage has already been done, especially to children whose development cannot be paused or repaired easily. This is why Farrakhan insists that survival cannot depend on faith in distant authorities alone. Environmental neglect reveals the limits of participation without control. Voting, advocacy, and appeals mean little if communities lack the organized strength to demand immediate accountability. Clean water, safe housing, and healthy surroundings are not privileges, yet they are treated as negotiable when the affected population is fragmented and politically weak. By connecting environmental harm to systemic design, Farrakhan reinforces the need for unity discussed earlier. Awareness without organization leads to outrage that fades. Organization turns awareness into protection. Communities that monitor their conditions, pool resources, and apply collective pressure reduce the space in which neglect can hide. This does not require perfection or total independence, but it does require vigilance and shared responsibility. The deeper warning is about normalization. When toxic conditions become expected, they cease to shock. Children grow up assuming unsafe water is temporary, that repairs will come someday, that their environment simply matters less. Farrakhan challenges this quiet acceptance. He urges communities to recognize that what is tolerated becomes policy, and what is endured becomes precedent. In this way, environmental justice becomes inseparable from self-determination. Protecting land, water, and health is not only a technical issue, but a reflection of how much value a community places on itself. When people believe their lives are worth defending, they stop accepting explanations that excuse harm. The story of environmental neglect is therefore not only about damage already done, but about whether future generations will inherit the same conditions or a different standard entirely. As the patterns of neglect become clearer and the limits of external solutions are exposed, Farrakhan returns to what he considers the central question beneath every struggle, whether a people can stand together long enough to protect themselves. In his view, unity is not a slogan or a momentary reaction to crisis, but the deciding factor between endurance and decline. Without it, even the most accurate understanding of injustice leads nowhere. He describes division as a quiet force, one that rarely announces itself yet steadily erodes collective strength. It appears in small fractures at first, differences in priorities, distrust between neighbors, generational misunderstandings, coupled with competing visions of progress. Over time, these fractures widen until shared purpose dissolves. When people no longer move together, their concerns lose weight, their demands lose urgency, and their suffering becomes easier to ignore. A divided community, Farrakhan warns, does not need to be defeated. It simply needs to be left alone. This is where apathy takes root, not the loud rejection of hope, but the slow exhaustion that follows repeated disappointment. When individuals feel isolated in their struggles, engagement begins to feel pointless. Effort seems wasted. Outrage fades into resignation. Farrakhan frames this state as especially dangerous because it benefits the very systems that produce harm. Exploitation thrives not only through force, but through fatigue. When people stop expecting change, neglect no longer has to justify itself. The consequences of this disengagement stretch beyond the present moment. Farrakhan speaks of generational decline not as an abstract theory, but as a lived reality. Children inherit more than physical conditions. They inherit expectations. When they grow up watching adults navigate broken systems without collective response, they learn to normalize limitation. Unsafe environments become background noise. Underfunded schools feel inevitable. Opportunities appear distant and uncertain. What began as division hardens into destiny. Unity, in contrast, interrupts this cycle. Farrakhan presents it as an active discipline rather than an emotional state. Unity requires patience, coordination, and the willingness to prioritize collective well-being over individual comfort. It does not eliminate disagreement, but it channels difference towards shared objectives. When communities move together, their presence becomes undeniable. Their concerns demand response because ignoring them carries visible cost. This idea ties back to every issue already raised. Political engagement gains meaning only when it reflects organized consensus. Environmental protection becomes possible when communities monitor and defend their own living conditions together. Economic power emerges when spending decisions are aligned rather than scattered. Even cultural renewal depends on shared standards that reinforce dignity and responsibility across generations. Unity, in Farrakhan's telling, is the thread that connects awareness to action. He is careful to distinguish unity from uniformity. The goal is not sameness of thought, but alignment of purpose. History, he reminds, offers countless examples where diverse individuals achieved progress because they recognized a common threat and a common future. When that recognition fades, exploitation resumes its quiet work. Systems do not need to innovate new forms of harm. They simply rely on disconnection to maintain existing ones. What makes Farrakhan's warning resonate is its simplicity. No external force benefits more from division than those already in positions of control. Fragmentation lowers resistance without confrontation. It turns potential movements into isolated voices. In this sense, unity becomes an act of protection. It shields communities not by confrontation alone, but by refusing to fracture under pressure. The deeper message is about continuity. Survival is not secured in moments of crisis alone, but in what is sustained between them. Unity ensures that lessons learned are not forgotten, that gains made are not easily reversed, and that children inherit not just struggle, but strategy. Farrakhan frames unity as the difference between reacting to harm and preventing it, between enduring decline and shaping direction. In the end, his emphasis is less about ideology than consequence. Division leads predictably to apathy. Apathy invites exploitation. Exploitation, left unchecked, becomes inheritance. Unity disrupts that chain. It does not guarantee ease or immediate victory, but it restores agency. And in a world where neglect has been normalized, reclaiming agency is itself an act of survival. With unity established as the foundation of survival, Farrakhan turns his attention to a powerful illusion that has shaped expectations for generations, the belief that leadership style is proof of moral direction. He challenges the idea that dignity in speech, refined manners, and carefully crafted images are reliable indicators of justice. In his view, the problem is not simply who occupies the highest office, but what people have been conditioned to overlook while watching the performance. He frames presidential politics as a stage where appearances often carry more weight than outcomes. Leaders speak in measured tones, wear the right symbols of authority, and promise stability. Yet the realities experienced by marginalized communities remain stubbornly unchanged. Policies are passed quietly, consequences unfold slowly, and responsibility becomes difficult to trace. Over time, the contrast between public image and lived reality grows so familiar that it stops raising alarm. Farrakhan argues that this disconnect is not accidental. A system that depends on consent must maintain credibility, even as it produces harm. Polished leadership serves that purpose. It reassures the public, reduces scrutiny, and softens resistance. When people are encouraged to judge leadership by presentation rather than impact, destructive outcomes can be framed as unfortunate side effects rather than deliberate choices. The language of respectability becomes a shield behind which accountability fades. This critique connects directly to the earlier discussion of disillusionment. When elections come and go without meaningful change, frustration deepens. Yet instead of questioning the structure itself, attention is often redirected toward personalities. One leader is blamed, another is celebrated, and hope is reset for the next cycle. Farrakhan warns that this pattern keeps communities locked in anticipation rather than preparation. The system survives not because it delivers justice, but because it continually renews expectation. He is careful not to dismiss political participation outright. Instead, he reframes its role. Elections, he suggests, were never meant to be the sole mechanism of protection for those without power. When communities treat voting as a substitute for organization, they place their survival in the hands of forces they do not control. Polished leadership thrives in this environment because it requires little from the public beyond patience and belief. History, as Farrakhan presents it, reinforces this lesson. Many of the most damaging policies affecting black communities emerged under leaders celebrated for their composure and intellect. Their speeches inspired confidence, their images projected progress, yet the outcomes included expanded surveillance, deepened economic inequality, and policies whose consequences lingered for decades. The contradiction is not personal, but structural. The office itself carries priorities that do not automatically align with the needs of the most vulnerable. This realization ties back to unity and leverage. Without organized pressure, leadership has no incentive to move beyond symbolism. Promises can be delayed, reframed, or quietly abandoned. Communities that lack collective strategy are left reacting to decisions already made, while the cycle of disappointment continues. Farrakhan's warning is that elections alone, no matter how passionately debated, cannot compensate for the absence of sustained power at the community level. He urges people to look beyond the rhythm of campaign seasons and ask harder questions about outcomes. What changes after the speeches end? Who benefits from the policies passed when public attention fades? And most importantly, what mechanisms exist to respond when leadership fails to deliver? Without answers rooted in collective strength, trust becomes vulnerability. In this way, his critique of presidential politics is not cynicism, but clarity. It strips away the comfort of illusion and replaces it with responsibility. If leadership is judged by results rather than appearance, communities must be prepared to measure, challenge, and respond. That readiness cannot be summoned every 4 years. It must be built continuously. Farrakhan's message closes the gap between awareness and action. Elections may influence direction, but they do not define destiny. Survival, he insists, depends on whether communities rely solely on leaders above them or invest in power among themselves. Polished leadership may command attention, but only organized unity can command change. As we reach the culmination of this story, Farrakhan's message becomes a call not merely for awareness but for deliberate action, a blueprint for survival rooted in economic self-determination and community sovereignty. He emphasizes that the true power lies not in the approval of external systems or in the fleeting promises of political leaders, but in the collective decisions of Black communities themselves, in the ways they choose to invest their time, their energy, and most critically, their money. Every dollar spent outside the community is a dollar lost to exploitation, while every dollar redirected into businesses, services, and initiatives that serve and uplift the people becomes a weapon against oppression, a tool of empowerment capable of reshaping neighborhoods, schools, and lives. Farrakhan reminds us that internal colonialism, the control of Black communities from outside forces through education, policing, politics, and economics cannot be broken by hope alone. It requires strategic discipline, a conscious effort to reclaim institutions that have long been used to enforce dependency. Education must be reframed to reflect Black history and excellence. Policing must serve to protect, not to oppress. Cultural values must be nurtured and celebrated rather than undermined by external narratives. By taking ownership of these systems, communities create resilience that cannot be dismantled by the neglect or malice of others. Economic self-determination, in this context, is not a passive choice but an active strategy. Farrakhan illustrates that the simple act of redirecting collective spending can have ripple effects beyond immediate profit, influencing local economies, creating jobs, and funding programs that strengthen families and youth. He encourages entrepreneurship and cooperative ventures, reminding communities that the tools for liberation are already within reach: knowledge, labor, capital, and shared vision. When harnessed collectively, these tools can rebuild what centuries of oppression have tried to destroy, creating safe, thriving, and self-sustaining environments. He also frames this strategy as a spiritual and moral act, a responsibility to honor the legacy of those who came before and to safeguard the future of generations to come. By asserting control over economic, educational, and social structures, Black communities assert their humanity, their dignity, and their right to exist on their own terms. This is not a call for isolation, but for intentional investment in self-preservation and mutual uplift, ensuring that wealth, knowledge, and power circulate in ways that strengthen rather than exploit. In closing, Farrakhan's message is both urgent and hopeful. The path to freedom and survival lies in unity, disciplined strategy, and the deliberate choice to reclaim control. The power to shape the future has always existed within the hands of the people, waiting only to be recognized, organized, and applied. To every listener who has followed this journey, take these words seriously. Reflect on your own role and imagine the collective impact of millions of conscious choices working toward empowerment and liberation. If this message resonates with you, take a moment to support the channel by liking, subscribing, and turning on notifications so we can continue sharing conversations that matter, ideas that empower, and strategies that transform. Thank you for listening and for being part of a movement toward awareness, unity, and self-determination.